The forest shook with a thunder that seemed endless. German forward observers crouched in their foxholes, trying to count the blasts 10, 20, 50, but the shells kept screaming overhead, detonating with relentless fury. The ground trembled, trees splintered, and the very air was shredded by steel fragments. To them, this was more than just an artillery barrage. It was a storm without horizon, a nightmare without pause. They knew their own guns, a few salvos, then silence as the crews rationed precious ammunition. But across the lines, the Americans fired as if their supplies were bottomless. Battery after battery roared the crack of the 105mm howitzers, blending with the deeper thunder of the 155 seconds. And when the explosions landed in unison, perfectly timed by the new technique called time on target, the effect was catastrophic. Entire positions vanished in simultaneous firestorms, leaving survivors stunned and deafened, unable to comprehend how the enemy could summon such violence at will. What German soldiers couldn't fathom was the staggering machine behind these barrages, an industrial engine churning out 4,000 artillery shells every single day. While their own factories struggled under bombing raids, shortages, and collapsing transport, America had transformed fields, rail yards, and assembly halls into rivers of steel and fire. To the Wehrmacht, every shell was counted, every round precious. To the US Army, ammunition was a tide that never ebbed. And in the chaos of war, that tide became a weapon more decisive than any tank or aircraft. A weapon measured not in single battles, but in the crushing weight of arithmetic itself. This is the story of how America's unimaginable artillery production reshaped the battlefield, shattered Axis hopes, and left enemies in disbelief. In the spring of 1940, when the thunder of German panzers rolled across Western Europe, few in Berlin believed that the United States could ever challenge their momentum. America, they thought, was still a land of consumer goods and Depression-era fragility, a place where factories built cars and refrigerators, not weapons of war. Hermann Goering himself sneered that the Americans could only make razor blades, dismissing the notion that across the Atlantic a dormant giant was about to awaken. But while Nazi leaders mocked US planners and engineers quietly set into motion an industrial transformation without parallel in history, an arsenal that would soon spew forth 4,000 artillery shells a day. To grasp the sheer shock this generated among German observers, one must first understand the pivotal role of artillery in World War II. Unlike the cinematic visions of dogfights or tank duels, it was artillery that truly decided the tempo of battle. Soldiers on every front agreed with the grim adage, artillery conquers, infantry occupies. The gun crews and their supply trains were the backbone of every advance, the shield against every counterattack. In France, the Wehrmacht had triumphed in 1940 with concentrated fire support and blitzkrieg speed, but by 1944 it was American artillery, relentless, overwhelming and precise, that would dictate the battlefield. The American approach to firepower was rooted not only in doctrine but in logistics. In the interwar years, the US Army had studied the carnage of World War I, where artillery barrages turned fields into lunar landscapes. They concluded that the next war would be won, not by conserving shells, but by ensuring that guns never fell silent. The Ordnance Department, often overlooked in peacetime, became the mastermind of this new vision. It mapped out a nationwide network of production steel mills in Pennsylvania, chemical plants in Virginia, powder works in Iowa, and assembly plants stretching from Illinois to California. Each would specialize, some forging shell casings, others mixing propellant, still others loading explosives and attaching fuses. Like an orchestra, every section had to play its part in harmony, producing not just weapons but an uninterrupted rhythm of supply. By 1942, after Pearl Harbor dragged America into total war, this plan leapt from blueprint to roaring reality. Entire cities seemed to pulse with the beat of production. At Radford Army Ammunition Plant in Virginia, convoys of trucks delivered tons of powder daily. At Joliet, Illinois, and at Badger in Wisconsin, rivers of molten steel were shaped into casings. Watervliet Arsenal in New York, dating back to 1813, thundered with the sound of machines cutting rifled barrels and fitting breech mechanisms. The Scranton Army Ammunition Plant filled thousands of shells every week, stamping them with lot numbers before stacking them high in wooden crates. Each plant worked around the clock, 3 shifts, 7 days a week, driven by men and women who knew that every extra hour of labor might mean more firepower for soldiers overseas. The scale was mind-boggling. By 1943, America was producing artillery shells by the millions, 105mm howitzer rounds, 155mm long tom shells, smoke and illumination rounds, even the terrifying new proximity-fused anti-personnel shells that would appear later in the war. Factories did not measure output by dozens or hundreds, but by freight trains, each carrying thousands of tons of ammunition. German intelligence agents piecing together reports from neutral countries struggled to believe the numbers. Could it be true that a single American plant produced more shells in a month than the Reich's entire army group consumed in the East? While production expanded at home, doctrine evolved in the field. The U.S. Army Field Artillery School at Fort Sill refined techniques of massed fires, rapid adjustment, and the now famous time on target. With this method, fire direction centers calculated trajectories so that dozens of shells fired from scattered batteries would land on a target simultaneously. The psychological effect was devastating. Enemy troops had no warning barrage to duck from, only sudden annihilation. The method depended on precise communication and abundant ammunition. Without endless shells, TOT was impossible. But with 4,000,000 rounds a day flowing forward, American gunners could unleash it again and again. Logistics, the lifeblood of this artillery juggernaut, became a spectacle in itself. Consider the Red Ball Express, that legendary convoy network after D-Day. Thousands of trucks driven day and night by American soldiers. Many of them, African Americans, serving in segregated units, carried ammunition from the beaches of Normandy to the advancing divisions inland. Their loads were staggering fuel rations, and above all, endless crates of artillery shells. To an infantryman at the front, those convoys meant survival. To a German soldier facing them, they meant despair. The shells never seemed to stop arriving, no matter how many were fired. In stark contrast, the German war economy by 1944 was collapsing under strain. Allied bombing crippled railways and factories. Oil shortages throttled transport. Copper, aluminum, and even basic steel grew scarce. German divisions rationed shells carefully, often allowing only a handful of rounds per gun each day. A battery commander might have to request approval before expending more than a few dozen shells in a support mission. Soldiers grew accustomed to silence after short barrages. Against this background, the thunder of American artillery, sustained hour after hour, felt not merely overwhelming but supernatural. The psychological impact was profound. Captured German officers frequently remarked that they could not understand how the Americans kept firing. "They shoot as if every man has his own factory behind him," one prisoner admitted. To him, the contrast was unbearable. His men cowering behind meager defenses, waiting for their last shells to be rationed, while across the lines U.S. gunners seemed to blaze without end. Thus, by late 1944, the stage was set for a collision of doctrines and economies. German soldiers braced for offensives, where their counter-barrages sputtered out in minutes. American commanders, confident in their logistical tail, prepared to drench enemy lines with steel and fire. And behind every round, fired from the hedgerows of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes, loomed the giant machine at home. An industrial nation transformed into an arsenal where the daily heartbeat of war was measured in 4,000,000 artillery shells. In the heart of America's wartime homeland, the story of every artillery shell began not at the battlefield, but at the factory floor. What looked like ordinary industrial plants, steel foundries, chemical works, machine shops, were by 1942 converted into cathedrals of destruction. Here, under the glow of molten furnaces and the whine of steel-cutting lathes, the raw materials of war were transformed into the daily thunder that shook Europe and the Pacific. The process began with steel, millions of tons of it drawn from Pennsylvania mills, or the vast open hearth works of the Midwest. Forged into billets and then elongated into cylinders, each casing was heated, pressed, and hammered into the distinctive shape of an artillery shell. Giant presses pounded the steel with relentless rhythm, shaping thousands per shift. The rough casings then passed to machinists who carefully turned the surfaces to precise tolerances. Threads were cut for fuses, driving bands fitted to engage rifling, and each shell inspected for imperfections. The scale was astonishing. Factories turned out tens of thousands of these casings daily, the clang of steel echoing across factory halls the size of small towns. But a shell casing was only a hollow vessel. Its deadly potential came from the chemistry inside. At plants like Radford, enormous vats bubbled with TNT and amatol, their acrid fumes clinging to the air. Workers in protective clothing, mostly women nicknamed powder girls or munitionettes, weighed explosive charges with meticulous care. They poured molten TNT into casings or pressed powdered explosives into blocks that fit perfectly inside the steel jackets. Every ounce had to be measured too little, and the shell would fail, too much, and it could detonate in the barrel. Safety was paramount, yet the risks were ever present. One careless spark could reduce an entire plant to rubble. Once filled, the shells moved to the fuse lines. Here, delicate precision replaced brute force. The fuse, whether point detonating, time delay, or the revolutionary proximity type, was a miniature marvel of engineering. Thousands were produced each day, often in separate factories, then shipped to be screwed into the waiting shells. The proximity fuse, developed under strict secrecy, represented one of the war's most decisive technological leaps. Using tiny radio waves, it could sense when a shell neared its target and detonate at the perfect moment. By late 1944, assembly lines across America were turning out millions of these devices, each one amplifying the lethality of every round. To keep pace with such demand, the work never stopped. 3 shifts rotated seamlessly: dawn, dusk, and midnight. Sirens wailed to signal the changing of crews, and workers poured in and out like tides. Cafeterias served meals at all hours, train whistles echoed outside, and bulletin boards tracked daily output like scoreboards. One visitor recalled entering a shell-loading plant where a giant sign read, "Yesterday 37452, today's goal 400000." It was not just a target, it was a challenge, a dare to outproduce the day before. The human element of this production cannot be overlooked. Men too old for combat and women who had never worked outside the home became essential cogs in this arsenal. Housewives learned to calibrate fuses, farmers' sons operated hydraulic presses, and students on summer breaks stacked crates of ammunition under the watch of stern army inspectors. African American and immigrant workers, often excluded from skilled trades in peacetime, now found themselves critical to the war machine. While discrimination persisted, the sheer urgency of production forced a measure of inclusion, creating workplaces that reflected the diversity of America itself. Despite the relentless pace, quality control remained uncompromising. Each batch of shells underwent rigorous testing. Random samples were fired on proving grounds where Army officers measured range accuracy and burst patterns. If defects were discovered, entire lots could be scrapped. The Army Ordnance Department insisted that no faulty shell reach the front, knowing that the lives of gun crews depended on flawless performance. Engineers developed gauges and jigs that allowed even inexperienced workers to achieve remarkable precision. By 1944, rejection rates had plummeted while output soared beyond even the most optimistic forecasts. The result was an industrial symphony. Steel mills, chemical plants, machine shops, and fuse factories all played their parts, coordinated by the invisible baton of the Ordnance Department. Railroads became the arteries of this system, carrying boxcars filled with fresh ammunition to coastal ports or inland depots. From there, the shells flowed outward like a river of steel, unstoppable, inexhaustible, and timed to the beat of war. For German intelligence officers peering at production figures smuggled through Sweden or Switzerland, the numbers defied belief. Could it really be that one American plant produced more in a week than an entire German army group fired in a month? Reports from the Eastern Front suggested so. Soldiers wrote that U.S. barrages dwarfed even the Red Army's famed artillery floods. A Wehrmacht colonel captured in Normandy admitted with disbelief, "They fire as though they have an ocean of shells while we count every round." The factory floors of America proved that he was right. Every day, as German troops scraped for a handful of shells, America forged 40,000 more. Each one bore the sweat of workers who never saw the battlefield but shaped its outcome nonetheless. To them, the war was measured not in miles advanced or towns captured, but in the ceaseless tally of steel cylinders rolling off the line, each destined to explode half a world away. By the time 1944 dawned, this arsenal had matured into a machine of staggering momentum. Plants once built to produce tractors or automobiles now built thunder itself. For the German soldier huddled in a trench, it meant the sky could erupt at any moment in barrages that seemed without beginning or end. And behind every shell lay a story of steel and sweat chemistry and courage, a reminder that America's greatest weapon was not just its army in the field, but the immense industrial army at home. If the factories of America were the beating heart of artillery production, the arteries and veins were the vast logistical network that carried each shell from forge to foxhole. A shell that began as molten steel in Pennsylvania or a block of TNT in Virginia undertook a journey of thousands of miles before it could roar from the barrel of a howitzer in France. That journey was itself a battle, a triumph of organization, transportation, and sheer determination that stunned both allies and enemies alike. The first stage of this journey unfolded in sprawling ammunition depots across the United States. Known as Class V depots, these sites were cities of crates, pyramids of wooden boxes stacked higher than houses, each stenciled with lot numbers, calibers, and warnings. Soldiers joked that if a lightning bolt ever struck one, it could level an entire county. Rail spurs led directly into the depots where boxcars lined up to be filled with thousands of rounds. Each car carried the lethal cargo eastward, toward ports like New York, Norfolk, or New Orleans. At the docks, the scene was one of ceaseless motion. Liberty ships, those utilitarian steel workhorses churned out by Henry Kaiser's yards, waited with their cavernous holds open. Longshoremen, many of them civilian volunteers or enlisted service troops, hoisted pallets of shells with cranes stacking them deep in the ship's belly. The figures were staggering. A single Liberty ship could carry tens of thousands of shells along with tanks, trucks, and rations. Convoys bristling with escort vessels then shepherded these ships across the submarine-infested Atlantic. Upon reaching Britain, the shells were unloaded into a web of supply depots that dotted the English countryside. Fields once used for sheep grazing became seas of ammunition under canvas covers. Villagers marveled at the mountains of crates, never imagining such stockpiles could exist. These caches served as the springboard for Operation Overlord, ensuring that when the Allies stormed Normandy, their guns would never fall silent for lack of ammunition. The true test came after D-Day. The narrow beaches of Normandy were no ordinary ports. They were tenuous lifelines hammered together by engineers under fire. Yet even here, the river of steel never slowed. Ammunition was unloaded by hand, by jeep, even by amphibious trucks called DUKWs. From the beaches it moved inland to ammunition supply points, ASPs, where quartermaster troops catalogued every crate before dispatching them to the front. The volume was immense by July 1944. Allied forces were consuming nearly 2,500 tons of ammunition per day in France. To feed this appetite, the Americans created one of the most remarkable logistical achievements of the war, the Red Ball Express. Beginning in late August 1944, when the French rail system lay shattered, thousands of trucks roared day and night along dedicated routes marked by red balls on signs. The convoys carried everything from gasoline to rations, but at their core, they hauled shells 105 mm, 155 mm smoke rounds, illumination rounds, stacked to the roofs of GMC and Studebaker trucks. Drivers, many of them young African-American soldiers who rarely received recognition in peacetime, became the unsung heroes of artillery dominance. Rain, mud, and Luftwaffe strafers could not halt them. They drove until exhaustion blurred their vision, guided by headlights blacked out with slits determined to deliver their deadly cargo. Once at the front, the shells entered the domain of the Fire Direction Center's FDCs. Here, officers with maps, radios, and slide rules transformed crates into firepower. When infantry scouts reported an enemy position, the FDCs calculated bearing range, charge, and fuse setting. They coordinated dozens of batteries spread across miles of countryside, ensuring that shells would land with terrifying precision. The miracle of time on target depended on this coordination. Shells fired at different times from different batteries would arc through the sky and arrive together, detonating in unison. To the enemy, it felt as if the heavens themselves had collapsed. The pace was relentless. Crews at the guns worked like machines: open breech, load shell, ram charge, slam breech, shut fire. In practiced hands, a 105 mm howitzer could deliver 100 rounds in an hour. Multiply that by dozens of guns in a division, then by multiple divisions in a corps, and the numbers swelled into the tens of thousands. Wooden shell crates piled up like barricades around firing positions. Empty brass casings glittered in the mud, forming knee-high drifts that testified to the storm unleashed. Behind the roar of each gun lay the invisible lifeline of logistics. Quartermasters at forward supply points counted their crates, carefully dispatching trucks under cover of night to keep the batteries fed. Engineers built bridges across rivers choked with retreating Germans just so ammunition trucks could cross. Maintenance crews kept the trucks rolling, often cannibalizing wrecks to patch the living fleet. Even aircraft joined the effort. C-47 seconds parachuted crates of shells into isolated units when roads failed. To German soldiers, the effect was beyond comprehension. Their own supply lines were crippled by Allied bombers, their railways shattered, their oil tanks empty. A German artillery battery might receive a few dozen rounds for an entire day of combat. They had to choose carefully, one barrage here, one counter-fire mission there, always with an eye on dwindling stockpiles. By contrast, American units seemed to drown the battlefield in fire without pause. A captured Wehrmacht lieutenant confessed in 1944, "When your guns open, we know the battle is lost before it begins. We cannot answer. We can only endure." The contrast was more than tactical. It was psychological. For every German soldier crouching in a foxhole, each incoming shell screamed not just destruction but a message: the enemy's resources are infinite, yours are not. Despair seeped into their ranks as barrages rolled on without end. By late 1944, many Wehrmacht reports described American artillery as the decisive factor breaking morale, more feared than tanks or aircraft. Thus, the river of steel flowed from Midwestern factories to French hedgerows, an unbroken chain of labor transport and fire direction. It was not glamorous like fighter aces or heroic like infantry charges, but it was devastatingly effective. America had turned logistics into a weapon, one that struck with as much force as any bomb or bullet. And as long as the trucks rolled and the guns fired, the battlefield echoed with a single truth: the United States could outshoot, outlast, and overwhelm any opponent. In the winter of 1944, deep in the forests of the Ardennes, the German High Command launched one final gamble, the Battle of the Bulge. It was meant to split the Allied front, capture Antwerp, and shatter the coalition's resolve. In the first days, the offensive achieved terrifying success. Panzer columns surged through the snow, American units reeled backward, and the front seemed on the brink of collapse. But even as German troops advanced, they felt an ominous presence growing around them, a constant thunderous reminder that the Americans commanded something the Wehrmacht no longer could: unending artillery fire. The Ardennes offered a harsh stage. Snowdrifts smothered supply routes, freezing winds cut through greatcoats, and fog hung thick, grounding much of the Allied air force. This was exactly what the Germans hoped for: a battlefield where their armor could move unseen, shielded from Allied bombers. But there was one factor they had miscalculated. Even without planes in the sky, American artillery remained omnipresent, pounding every road, every ridge, every assembly area the moment it was detected. The climax came in late December, when German forces pressed hard toward the town of Bastogne. Surrounded on all sides, the 101st Airborne Division clung to the town's defenses. German officers expected the Americans to collapse for lack of supplies. Instead, Bastogne's defenders unleashed artillery at a pace that shocked their besiegers. Batteries firing from the perimeter, supported by corps-level guns beyond the encirclement, rained shell after shell onto German columns. Despite icy roads and shattered bridges, ammunition kept arriving by truck, and even by parachute, dropped in bundles from C-47 aircraft. For every German attempt to mass troops or fuel vehicles, a salvo of American shells tore the formations apart. By the 23rd of December, the fog lifted just enough for Allied spotter planes to take to the skies. Now the artillery could combine ground observers, aerial reconnaissance, and the full power of time on target. Within hours, American fire direction centers were orchestrating barrages that hit with terrifying synchronicity. German soldiers described the horror: one moment, silence the next, an eruption that flattened entire clearings. The new proximity fuses amplified the carnage. Shells detonated above the ground, showering deadly fragments onto troops who once thought themselves safe in foxholes or tree cover. Survivors called it the Rain of Steel. The numbers told the story of desperation and supremacy. On the 24th of December alone, U.S. artillery units in the Ardennes fired more than 2,500,000 rounds, far more than the German armies could hope to fire in an entire week. At the peak of the battle, certain corps-level formations expended 4,000,000 shells in a single day, exactly the figure that had seemed so impossible to German intelligence only months earlier. The effect was crushing. Whole battalions found themselves pinned down, unable to advance, supply lines shredded before they could even reach the front. German commanders radioed frantic reports. Enemy artillery is constant. Our men cannot move. Inside Bastogne, weary paratroopers drew strength from the thunder surrounding them. Each salvo that crashed into the German lines was a promise that they were not alone, that the arsenal of democracy was reaching across the ocean to fight beside them. For the Germans outside the town, the barrages became an endless nightmare. One captured officer, shivering in the snow, confessed to his American interrogators, "We thought you would run out of shells. Instead, the more we attacked, the more you fired." The psychological devastation was as real as the physical. Soldiers, huddled in frozen foxholes, spoke of the earth itself, rebelling against them, of a foe who could summon storms without warning. Their leaders had promised that American industry could not sustain such expenditure. But the truth was undeniable. The US war machine had turned artillery into an inexhaustible weapon. German morale, already stretched by hunger and cold, cracked under the barrage. As Patton's Third Army broke through from the south and lifted the siege of Bastogne, the German dream of a decisive victory evaporated. Instead of splitting the Allies, the Ardennes offensive had bled the Wehrmacht white. The battlefield was littered with burned-out tanks, shattered columns, and fields scarred by tens of thousands of shell craters. American gunners, their ears ringing and hands raw from constant loading, knew they had played a decisive role. The shells had not stopped, and that unceasing thunder had turned the tide. The Battle of the Bulge revealed the climax of America's artillery supremacy. In those snowy forests, the promise of 4,000 shells a day was no longer a boast but a reality. For German soldiers who had once mocked America's factories as incapable of true war production, the experience was unforgettable. They had been buried under the proof. This was the moment when arithmetic defeated ambition. For every German tank there were a dozen shells waiting. For every counterattack, a barrage that erased it. The Ardennes showed the world that American artillery was more than a support arm. It was the hammer that crushed the Reich's final hope. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the echoes of America's artillery supremacy still reverberated across battlefields scarred by craters and shattered forests. To many German officers, the most haunting memory of the war was not the swarms of American tanks or the clouds of Allied bombers, but the endless roar of US artillery. They had entered the conflict convinced that American industry was too soft, too fragmented, too devoted to consumer luxuries to sustain a modern war. Instead, they discovered a machine capable of producing 40,000 shells a day, delivering them across an ocean, and firing them without hesitation. That realization left scars deeper than shrapnel. The aftermath of this industrial miracle was twofold: immediate victory on the battlefield, and long-lasting influence on the geopolitics of the post-war world. In the short term, American firepower broke the back of the Wehrmacht. German war diaries from the Ardennes and the Rhineland offensive contain repeated laments about constant bombardment, uninterrupted fire, and devastating barrages. Commanders complained that no movement was possible in daylight, that assembly areas were obliterated before an attack could even begin. Units collapsed not only from casualties but from sheer psychological exhaustion. It was one thing to fight tanks or infantry, it was another to face a storm that never abated, that rained down steel every hour of every day. Strategically, America's artillery dominance meant that its generals could plan offensives with confidence. Unlike their German counterparts who agonized over whether ammunition stockpiles could sustain a week of fighting, American commanders often fired shells generously to soften resistance even in limited operations. In Normandy, they leveled hedgerows with preparatory fire. In the Siegfried Line, they smashed pillboxes until the concrete cracked. In the crossing of the Rhine, they poured shells onto the far bank until defenders simply melted away. Behind every bold maneuver was the unspoken certainty there would be enough shells to finish the job. The impact extended far beyond World War II. In the post-war years, military planners around the globe studied the American example. The lesson was stark: industrial might was as decisive as battlefield brilliance. The NATO alliance, formed in 1949, built its entire artillery doctrine on standardized calibers like 105mm and 155mm weapons, born from US wartime production. Stockpiles across Western Europe brimmed with American-designed shells, a constant reminder that the United States remained the arsenal of democracy. Equally significant was the technological legacy. The proximity fuse, perfected in American factories during the war, proved to be a revolutionary leap. It made each shell exponentially more lethal, ensuring that bursts occurred at the perfect altitude for maximum fragmentation. During the Battle of the Bulge, German infantry caught in the open described it as death from above, impossible to escape. After the war, this technology carried forward into anti-aircraft defense and eventually into guided munitions. What began as an industrial gamble became the seed of modern precision firepower. On the home front, the legacy of production left lasting marks as well. The vast network of ammunition plants, some mothballed, some kept alive in warm base status, became a cornerstone of American readiness during the Cold War. Communities that had once churned out shells in Joliet, Scranton, and Radford continued to see their factories maintained ready to spring to life should another global conflict erupt. Workers who had once been farmers or housewives returned to civilian life with new skills, having proven that America could mobilize not just soldiers, but entire societies for war. For the veterans who had endured the barrages on both sides, the memories were unforgettable. American gunners recalled the exhaustion of ceaseless loading, the acrid smoke that clung to their clothes, the ringing in their ears that never fully faded. Yet many spoke with pride. They had been the god of war, the decisive arm that broke the enemy's will. German survivors, by contrast, remembered the terror of incoming fire, the earth erupting around them without pause. Prisoners often confessed that it was the artillery that convinced them the war was unwinnable. "Against tanks we could fight," one soldier admitted. "Against planes we could hide. But against your artillery there was nothing. You never stopped." The broader meaning was clear. World War II was not won solely by daring raids or heroic charges. It was won by numbers, by production lines, by the ability to turn raw steel into a torrent of firepower. America's daily output of 4,000 artillery shells symbolized this reality. It was a figure so immense, so beyond the grasp of German planners, that it seemed less like strategy and more like inevitability. As the Cold War dawned, US strategists enshrined that lesson. Deterrence rested not only on nuclear weapons but on the proven capacity to outproduce any adversary in conventional arms. The rivers of shells from the 1,942nd became the metaphor for America's broader strength. When challenged, the nation could summon an industrial storm so vast that no enemy could withstand it. And so the legacy of those 4,000 daily shells lived on, not just in the craters that scarred Europe, but in the geopolitical balance that followed. For Germany and Japan, it was a humbling revelation of their miscalculation. For the Allies, it was proof that democracy, when mobilized, could be more powerful than dictatorship. For the United States, it was a point of enduring pride. The war had begun with Nazi leaders scoffing at American industry. It ended with those same leaders crushed beneath the weight of its output, the thunder of US. Artillery became the sound of inevitability, the sound of a world reshaped by the power of factories, workers, and the relentless will to supply freedom's armies.